Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to Talking Tudors episode 90. I do hope you're all keeping well. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger, and it's lovely to have your company. As this is the first episode of the month, I'd like to begin by thanking the wonderful patrons who continue to support this podcast and welcome patrons who joined the Talking Tudors family in October. A very warm welcome to Renaud, Elsk, Lorna, Michelle, Mike. Thank you so much for joining Nicole, Laura and Naylene. I'm so very thankful for your support and immense generosity. If you love the podcast and tune into every episode, perhaps you'd consider becoming a Talking Tudors patron. Just click on the Be My Patron on Podbean badge on the homepage of my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, or click on the Be a Patron button on the Podbean app. Join the Talking Tudors patron family, and in addition to receiving lots of Tudor-themed goodies, you'll be automatically entered into our patron-only monthly giveaways. November's prize is a copy of The Birth of a Queen, Essays on the Quincentenary of Mary I, edited by Sarah Duncan and Valerie Schutte. A huge thank you to Valerie for sponsoring this great prize. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled that joining me on the show to talk about early modern women and book ownership is Martine van Elk. Martine is a professor of English at California State University. She's published extensively on early modern women, Shakespeare and vagrancy. Her work has appeared in edited collections and journals. Her book, Early Modern Women's Writing, Domesticity, Privacy and the Public Sphere, was published by Palgrave in 2017. She's currently working as a section editor for the new Palgrave Encyclopedia of Early Modern Women's Writing in English, and writing a comparative study of women on and behind the stage in England, the Dutch Republic and France. My conversation with Martine straight after this musical break, courtesy of guitarist Jon Sayles. welcome to Talking Tudors, Martina. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm really excited to talk to you today. So I suppose a great place to start is you just introducing yourself to our listeners and just telling us a little bit about your background.
I'm a professor of English at California State University in Long Beach. I've been here for 20 years, which is a really long time. I'm originally from the Netherlands. I did a PhD in Texas. And so it's kind of a circuitous route to this job eventually. Well, my research was initially on Shakespeare and vagrancy. And eventually, once I started teaching, I got really interested in early modern women. So lately, my research has been largely on early modern women, not just English early modern women, but also women from the Dutch Republic. And now I'm trying to add French women as well. So I use a comparative perspective.
Yeah, fascinating subject. And I know that you've written a book called Early Modern Women Writers. And a lot of the work you do, because I've done a little bit of research on you, focuses, like you just said, on early modern women. So what exactly sparked your interest in this area or this subject? And why do you think it's an important area for us to study?
I initially got interested in women writers from teaching. I was teaching a lot of Shakespeare and a lot of surveys. And I found that the students really wanted to hear women's own voices, not just see women represented, by male writers. And then what happened in the late 1990s, I discovered a huge body of work by early modern Dutch women. And I felt that they were could be very interestingly paired up with English early modern women. So that's how I got interested in doing comparative work. I found that when we look at women writers, they're working in a patriarchal society. So they're in a place where education is not always easy to get. They are discouraged from writing. They're not supposed to emerge in the public sphere. They're not supposed to speak publicly. And so I'm really interested in how women have dealt with those kinds of obstacles, the kind of tension between the way they're supposed to behave and their actual experiences. I like to tell my students that, there were as many different kinds of people in the early modern period as there are today. And just the ideology when it came to gender was more strict. And so women writers are uniquely positioned to kind of deal with that tension between ideology and their lived experiences. So their writings are very complex and interesting. They're not always about gender. For a very long time, we've only looked at them from that angle. But I do feel there's something to be gained by looking at them together and comparing how they respond to these various ideological obstacles to public speech in particular.
Now, you contribute to a blog called Early Modern Female Book Ownership. So can you tell us a little bit about this project?
Yes. Well, what happened is this project really started through Twitter, believe it or not. I noticed that a few people, and I was one of them, were posting images when we found them of female signatures in early modern books. And we felt that it would be a shame if these were just recorded in tweets. We wanted to find a place where there was, a more permanent reflection on these various pieces of evidence of female book ownership. And so along with a number of other people, we started this blog. And what we do is every week we feature a book, sometimes more than one book, that has evidence of female book ownership in it, and we discuss the book, and if possible, if we can find out who the owner is, then we discuss the owner as well. And in that way, we keep some of these, particularly if they're books that are being sold on eBay, for instance, or other websites, they can disappear forever into private hands, and academics won't know about them anymore. So this way we preserve them for scholarship, and we get to find out all the different kinds of books that women read, and also the different types of evidence of ownership that they left in those books. From small scribbles and some marginalia to larger calligraphic signatures and so on. And so we use the hashtag on Twitter, her book, because this is something that women often put in their book. And actually, men did his book, but women would put their names and then they would say, so-and-so, her book. And so that's our hashtag on Twitter. So if you look for that hashtag, you can find a lot of our evidence too. And we've been supported really widely by booksellers who allow us to use their images, by libraries. Librarians have written posts for us, individual scholars, people who own the books have written blog posts for us. So it's really become a kind of collective effort to keep all of this for posterity.
Yeah, it's a fascinating project. I know I was browsing it myself, and I love when I find an old book and it has an inscription in it. It's like such an immediate connection to the owner, isn't it? And there's something quite powerful about that, I find. So
Yes,
can anyone alert you to a book? So if somebody, one of the listeners perhaps has something or has seen something, can they get in touch via Twitter and mention it?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Absolutely. People tag me all the time, and so I get to see quite a few. And I always invite people to write their own blog posts if they want to. We're pretty open. Some posts are very short, some are much longer, so long as they have images in them. But if they have their own books or they found something, we would love to hear. Yes, we'd be delighted to feature them.
That's great, thank you. And it's interesting that you mentioned the her book or the his book. I know that I'm pretty sure it's George Berlin that wrote This Book Is Mine. And I like how people kind of announce, that that's theirs. Like now we don't tend to do that anymore, do we?
Yeah, no. And often, now we like to, when we buy a secondhand book, we want it to be clean.
Yeah.
But if it's a 17th century or 16th century book, you love it if there are some doodles or notes. It kind of gives you this direct line to the early modern reader.
Absolutely, I totally agree with you. Now, before we move on to talk about some of the books that women owned and read, I suppose we should probably just briefly mention something about the literacy rate among women in the 16th and early 17th century.
This is a tricky question. It's difficult to answer, and it's I'd hate to quantify, the literacy rate in terms of percentages, because you have ranges of literacy. One of the things is that reading and writing were taught separately. So it's very difficult to find out how many people were literate. People in the past have looked at signatures on legal documents, for instance, and so they would conclude if somebody made the mark of a cross or something, they would conclude that person was illiterate. But that may not actually have been the case. They may have been able to read. And of course, there are changes, like you might learn to read at some point. You might sign a document at one moment with a cross, but then be able to read later on. So it is difficult to measure. What we do know, I think it's pretty clear that the literacy rates went up for women over the course of the 16th and 17th century. By the end of the 17th century, they're definitely higher than they were at the beginning of the 16th century. I think we can say that without a doubt. And, of course, if you were a woman working in a kind of business, a shop of some kind, you have a certain level of literacy that you need for your work. And so that encouraged literacy. The Reformation encouraged literacy because everybody was encouraged to read the Bible. Although there is some anxiety about what happens when women read the Bible themselves, you might want to read it out loud to them as the husband and explain what it means. Generally, women were encouraged to read the Bible. And with the rise of print, of course, the inventing of the printing press, that enabled far more people to buy books and to look at books. And so there's definitely a female readership, a female audience by the time we get to the late 16th century. There are prefaces to women readers. They knew that women loved to read romance novels, those kinds of things. And so what we can say, obviously, the higher your social status is, the more likely you are to be literate, although middling women who had businesses were more likely to be literate. Among the lower classes, there's going to be lower levels of literacy. So in terms of numbers, probably the majority couldn't read very well, could read some, I suppose. So I think that's as much as I would like, as I feel comfortable speculating.
Of course, no, and it's very tricky. I love some of the letters that I've read from 16th century women where they kind of say, my writing's absolutely awful, you're not going to be able to understand one word of it, but they still give it a go. So that's pretty good.
The spelling is often very interesting when you look at women's writing. And you have to just read it out loud, because then you pronounce it, you can see what they're trying to say.
Absolutely. That's such a good tip to anyone listening. So you mentioned some romance novels in there, which is quite interesting. So what kinds of books did women in the 16th century and 17th century have access to, own, read? What was the sort of popular thing?
Well, this depended on the social status of the woman, of course. Lower social status. Most people would have a Bible in the house. So I would assume many women had access to Bibles, devotional manuals. And when you look at what women owned, a lot of the books are religious. So a lot of the books on our blog that we find are religious books. And they had special affection for those types of books. But, we also see quite a few literary texts. I think that would be the kind of second category, literature. We have lots of women who own plays, books of poetry, and then those prose romances for sure. They like those too. Then interestingly also books of history. Women like those too. And predictably household books, cookbooks, books on gardening, advice books on how to raise children. Those were very popular with women too. You're less likely to find books in Latin or Greek because women were generally not educated in those languages. They didn't know them. You're less likely to find a law book that a woman might own or a scientific book. Later in the 17th century, and among aristocratic women who were very well educated, you would find books of philosophy and science. Some aristocratic women were very interested in alchemy, so they might have alchemical works, for instance. So, even though there are some books that would be considered male domains, or like political pamphlets, for instance, we do see women owning those as well, just in smaller numbers.
So these are obviously books that women were reading and had access to. Were women producing texts or contributing to texts as well at this time?
Yes, definitely. And we see an increase in the 17th century again. So it's kind of this slow growth, from starting off in little bits and pieces in the 16th century. Initially, what you see a lot is religious works again, and also translations. As part of a kind of good humanist education, if you wanted to educate your daughter, you were allowed to let her translate works by men. That was one way in which women could write. And translation was not at all considered a secondary activity. So on the one hand, it was considered respectable for women to do it because you kind of limited them to what a man had already written for them.
Right.
On the other hand, it was quite a prestigious thing to do. And so, and one of the things many women did was psalm translation or psalm paraphrase, for instance. So we see quite a lot of that. But then when we get to this, later 16th century, we're beginning to see poetry and literature of various kinds. And then over the course, by the time you get to the end of the 17th century, women are writing all kinds of books. They are writing political pamphlets, cookbooks, diaries, letters. There is the fantastic woman writer, Margaret Cavendish. I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she wrote in all kinds of genres: natural philosophy, science fiction, utopian fiction, poetry, plays, everything. The output just grows steadily, but there's definitely a female voice there. The majority of books published are printed. When I say published, I mean printed.
Yeah.
There are also, of course, women whose texts circulated in manuscript, which is another form in which you could publish your work. That's very important. But by the late 17th century, you can find printed books with women's names on the title page regularly.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I do love those manuscripts that circulated at court where people added their own little, they're just amazing. Yeah. Now, you mentioned a prolific writer there. There's another multi-talented woman by the name of Esther Ingles, who I believe produced something like 60 books. What do we know of the life of this exceptional woman, and what kinds of books was she writing?
Oh, it's so lovely that you're asking me about her. She was such a fascinating woman. It's kind of interesting because she's not just a writer, but she's often called a book artist. Or a calligrapher. She translated some books, but mostly copied books in miniature version and slightly larger versions, handwritten or calligraphed, with beautiful lettering and all kinds of images. She was born in England. Both her parents were French. They were refugees, Protestant refugees from France. And they moved to Scotland. And her mother was a calligrapher who taught Esther to write in the way that she did. And so she married someone called Bartholomew Kellow, who was a scribe for the court of James VI. And so she helped him, but she also started producing these gift books. And those are the kind of 60 books that you're referring to.
Yes.
They were books that they were mostly religious books, Protestant books, and she would present them to royalty, but also to aristocrats, to important figures at court. Usually Protestants, so she was kind of advancing the Protestant cause and trying to get patronage at the same time. But some of them are really fascinating because some of her early works, for instance, she copies printed texts, and she copies them so well that they look as if they're printed, which is a very interesting sort of reversal of what you might expect. There are others where she decorates them with flowers. There are self-portraits in some of them that are really fascinating. If people are interested, they can look up Georgiana Ziegler of the Folger Library has done a blog for the Folger, the Collation blog, on Esther Ingles, and you can see some of the images that of the manuscripts that are currently housed in the Folger Shakespeare Library, where you can just see fascinating little self-portraits that she makes. So a really interesting figure who combined, she worked in manuscript, but she worked sort of across the boundary lines between manuscript and print by copying print versions of books.
Yeah, and I was really excited to talk to you about her because we don't often hear about her. And I have to say, I've only recently come across her when I've been doing a bit more research in this area. And I've suddenly developed this obsession for portrait miniatures. So her work is so fascinating because they're tiny little things, aren't they? A lot of the books.
Yeah. Yes. It's great when you see them digitized, when they actually give you a hand next to it or something.
Yes.
So you can see the actual size of some of these. And
the self-portraits are quite amazing, aren't they?
Yes, they're wonderful.
Absolutely. And there are quite a few in the public domain. So I'll make sure that I share some for our listeners to have a look at when the episode is published as well. So Martina, on these podcast episodes, I do like to do a little bit of myth busting and clarifying of facts and that kind of thing. So perhaps you can help. I've read that Catherine Parr, which was of course Henry VIII's final sixth wife, was the first woman let me see if I can get this right, it's quite a mouthful, the first woman in England to publish her own work in English and in print under her own name. So does that sound right to you? Is that correct?
That's my understanding. We can always still be corrected at some point, but that's my current understanding. There were others, Margaret Beaufort and Margaret Roper, who published anonymously before this.
Yes.
And Catherine Parr published her first work anonymously first and then with her own name on it. But I do still think that we can consider her the first one. Yes.
Excellent. That sounds great. Now, during the course of your research, and you've mentioned that you've been working in your current position for quite some time, what other books have you come across that were owned or written by 16th century women, and what do they tell us about their lives?
Obviously, books written by women, there are quite a few that I've looked at, but I've done some research into Mary Sidney Herbert's psalm translations. I think they're kind of early 17th century, though. Yeah. I'm pushing the boundaries a little bit. She is a fascinating writer who was the sister of Philip Sidney. I'm sure your listeners will be familiar with Philip Sidney's sonnets and his works. And so when he died in the wars in the Dutch Republic, the war against Spain, she finished some of his works. She also wrote some of her own elegiac poetry about him. But she finished his psalm translations and did way more translations than he had done. So the majority of the psalm translations are his. And so one of the things she did was first of all, she was a really well-known aristocrat, very powerful. So she had the ability to have her work appear in print. There's no apology on her part ever for having her work published. But she also did this under the guise of, I'm finishing the work of my famous brother. So that is a convenient. So it's always interesting with women writers to look at how they authorize their writing. Yes. Where do they get the authority from? And of course, she could get that from her famous brother. And so when you look at the psalm translations, they're incredibly rich and they're beautifully done. And they are in all these different styles. These ones weren't actually printed during her lifetime. They actually stayed in manuscript, but they circulated really widely. And then, interestingly, also her niece is Mary Roth, who became a writer too, and who wrote in many of the genres that her famous uncle and aunt published in. So when it comes to ownership, I was looking at our website to see what do we have that's 16th century. And one of the difficult things is sometimes you have a 16th century book, but you have a signature in it. And if it's undated, we don't know whether it's a 16th century or a later signature. So that can be a tricky thing. We have a couple, some of them are sermons, they're, by Hugh Latimer, for instance. We have an Italian book, a history of the Turco-Persian Wars. Tara Lyons wrote about those, that were in the library of Elizabeth Talbot. And they eventually ended up in the Bodleian. And we know this in that case, not because of a signature, but because of the binding. So the binding was stamped with the Talbot family dog, which you can see, and then her initials, E.G. So that's how we know it's part of her library. We have a book that is a sort of Puritan book about prayers and ministrations of the sacraments. But this is found by Sarah Lindenbaum. That one is signed by a woman called Catherine Rouse. We don't know who she was. So sometimes we're still in the process. Sometimes we can find out who it was. Sometimes it takes a little while, or we'll never know who this woman was or exactly when she signed. We have, a vague sense of signatures in terms of the dating, but not precise. So you can't be absolutely sure. One of the books that I find really interesting, but this is a bit later, if you're bear with me.
I'll bear with you, we'll allow you.
Not Tudor. I found this one book it was signed by a woman named Margaret Campbell, and it's called The Young Man's Guide by Thomas Gouge. This was a Puritan book published in 1696, and it's full of advice for young men, like, what to do when you're angry, how to avoid drunkenness, what to do about swearing and lying and backbiting, all this very practical advice. And in the book, there's a signature that says, "This book belongs to me, Margaret Campbell, March 12th, 1698, price 10 pence. I love it when the price is there too.
That's fantastic.
And it doesn't just have that signature, it also has a bookplate. And the bookplate shows us that it's part of the library of Patrick Hume, who was the first Earl of Marchmont. And so I looked at Patrick Hume and found out that his daughter-in-law was named Margaret Campbell. And so through that, I could find out that she had married just in July before she bought the book, and that she had a daughter in 1698. So my suspicion is that she was pregnant with her daughter and thought it might be a boy, and then bought this book of advice to young men to prepare for this birth. It turned out to be a daughter. She did have 7 children total, and a bunch of them were sons, so she could use the book later. But I think it's very interesting to see this bookplate that sort of says this is part of this male library. And of course, when we think legally, everything women owned was legally owned by their husbands. And so a lot of times we don't know which books were theirs because they were considered their husbands, or in this case, father-in-law. So there's the bookplate, but then she put this very clear inscription in to say, this is my book and I bought it for 10 pence. So that's kind of interesting, how you can go from one signature in a book to kind of begin to uncover a whole story behind it.
What a great story. I love that. That's excellent. And that's on your website, isn't it?
That's on the website, yes, for sure.
Now, when I was doing a little bit of research and reading and having a look at the website, I came across the genre called Mothers' Legacies, which I was quite interested in. And apparently that flourished in the 17th century. So could you tell us a little bit about that genre, what it encompassed, and what it sort of tells us about women's attitudes towards childbirth at the time?
Yeah, these were very popular books. These were some of women writers' most popular books. There are 2 in particular. It's one by a woman called Elizabeth Jocelyn, which is called The Mother's Legacy to Her Unborn Child from 1622. And there's another one by Dorothy Lee called The Mother's Blessing. Those are 2 very popular books that went through multiple editions, were bought over and over again. And they show the kind of 2 possibilities here. The genre is one where a woman is writing to her children, and she's giving them often practical and devotional advice on how to live and what to be like. Now, Elizabeth Jocelyn wrote this on the eve of giving birth, and in the early modern period, of course, giving birth to a child was a dangerous thing. And actually, the more upper class you were, the more likely you were to be pregnant a lot. Because you had a wet nurse, and so you would hand off your babies to the wet nurse, and that meant you could get pregnant very quickly again. And so some of these women gave birth to, 14, 15 children or something. And every time there's a risk of death. Elizabeth Jocelyn wrote that she had the premonition that she might die in childbirth, and indeed she did. And so this book became a kind of bestseller, with that tragic story in mind, and contains her sort of wishes for her children and advice to them. Dorothy Lee is different because she wrote when her children were growing up and grown up partly. And so she is, past childbearing at that point, and writes from this much more confident position of being a mother, talking to her children. She writes a lot about, how much they have to pray and so on. But she also includes, she tells them basically what to name her grandchildren. She wants to have control over that. So one of the things, I guess, if we think about how women authorize their writing, this is a powerful way to authorize your writing, to say, I am a mother, and therefore I'm going to give my children advice. And not just that, I'm going to broadcast that advice to the world so that other people can use it as well. The pregnancy part, of course, there's no doubt that women were scared of pregnancy, that it was a very dangerous thing to be pregnant at the time. But we see the double thing, that it could give you a level of authority, kind of an ability to speak from a certain position. But at the same time, there's this fear, of course, about pregnancy and what it can do to women.
I think that one was Jocelyn? Was it Jocelyn?
Yes, Elizabeth Jocelyn.
It's fascinating. Is that available for people to have a look at freely online? Do you know, or do you need to actually?
Undoubtedly, I think it will be available possibly on Google Books. A lot of these books have been digitized.
Yes.
Sometimes there are websites. I don't know a particular website for that one. But certainly I think you would be able to find it. It might be a later edition, but it went through so many editions, I would imagine that we can find it. There's another source that is the Folger has a website called Luna, and you can find books on that too. And I believe Dorothy Lee is on it. I imagine Elizabeth Jocelyn is too.
Fantastic. I'm going to have a look for that one. So is there any evidence to suggest that women, other than the nobility and Tudor queens and that kind of thing, owned personal libraries? I know I love my library and I often come in here and sit in here and, curl up and read a book. Is there any evidence that women had a dedicated space to go and read or to store their books at all?
Yes, and yes, definitely. I mean, again, we're talking about upper class women or aristocratic women who had that kind of space in their households. But the closet, that was the study where women kept their books. And we have several types of evidence of women owning large numbers of books. We have, obviously there are the signatures, but they tend to tell us just an individual book. And there are those book bindings that will tell us that a book belonged to a particular woman. We also have inventories. Wills, again, we have some wills, but they can be problematic because the husband is the one who owns everything. So much more frequently you'll find male wills, and the books owned by the woman might be subsumed under the husband's. But sometimes women made inventories of their own libraries, and occasionally paintings. I can tell you about an interesting painting in a moment. But there's one particular woman I wanted to mention called Frances Wolferson, and Sarah Lindenbaum has done a lot of research on her and also has a website on her. She was a gentrywoman from the Midlands who owned over 230 books. Sarah has been able to trace a lot of these books. They were auctioned off in 1856. They are all over the place now, but she signed them and sometimes commented and said, a pretty book about this or that, or she gave her a little review sometimes. And she also left some of these to her children and grandchildren. And so that is a particularly fascinating case of a woman with a large library. We have others that people have looked at inventories and lists to see what they owned. Another case is Lady Anne Clifford. I don't know if you're familiar with her. She was an aristocrat. She had a very interesting sort of troubled history when it came to her inheritance. She was an only child. Her brothers had died. Her father was supposed to leave all his lands, which were quite a few, and houses to her, but he didn't. Instead, he left it to his younger brother. And so she spent much of her life suing to get her lands back. And she did eventually get them back. It took a very long time though. And she wrote a diary, which we're still reading. But the other thing she did is she had a painting made. It's called The Great Picture, which was made in 1646. It's a triptych. In the middle is her family with her mother pregnant with her. And her mother already has a few books associated with her. Her mother is holding a book of Psalms. There's a Bible, a book of alchemy, because her mother was interested in that, and a book by Seneca. And then on the left, we see Anne Clifford, age 15, with books behind her. And on the right, she is 56, I believe, with books behind her. And all those books, we can see the bindings and we can tell what they are, what the books are that she owned. And so we can see, some of the books on the left side when she's 15 are Castiglione's The Courtier and Sidney's Arcadia, a Bible, of course, an atlas. There are a variety of books, and they're all very neatly stacked. But then on the right side, when she's in her 50s, the books are all over the place, just sort of piled up as if she has been using them and reading them. And there are a lot of very sort of learned books of theology, but also books of architecture, books on mortality, but also Johnson's plays, John's poems. So from those types of evidence, and actually she's in a closet space in those two images. So from those types of evidence, whether it's an inventory or an actual painting, we get a sense of some women really cherishing their books and spending a lot of time with them. We believe she had her books often read to her by someone, although of course she was very literate. And also it looks like that person also sometimes made little marginal notes for her. Reading went from being a sort of what we think in the 16th century, more of a collective experience where people were reading out loud more, to a private experience under the influence of the Reformation. And so it becomes more and more something you do in your study all by yourself, as you're doing, I suppose, right? In this private little space. But the whole concept of privacy is something that just develops very gradually over this time and changes greatly. So that's where reading comes to be an important part of that.
Yeah, it's so fascinating, isn't it? And we see that change in the concept of privacy reflected in the buildings, how the Tudors, they retreated further into this labyrinth of private rooms and apartments. And it's quite interesting to see the change. I wonder if they took books to bed and read them in bed like we do. We need evidence for that now.
Yes, but probably Samuel Pepys probably has something to say about that, I imagine, in his diary. Probably by the end of the 17th century, I would imagine that with candles, they would be sitting in their beds.
I guess it would be a bit dangerous, wouldn't it? Because you'd have to have the candle quite close, and then it's a risk of fire, I think. And so Frances Wolferson, did you say Frances?
Yeah.
What period was that in?
That is, she lived from 1607 to 1677.
Okay. Great, that sounds fascinating too. I need to go and have a look at that incredible library as well. Amazing.
The final type of evidence we can look at is women's writing. There's a woman called Hester Poulter, whose manuscript was not discovered until the 1990s. She wrote it in the 1650s, and she wrote all these poems. There's a fabulous website called the Poulter Project that people can look at for her poems. And the poems are full of references to astronomy, for instance. So she most certainly had books that she was reading that had to do with that, that she relied on. So sometimes we can look at poems and sort of try and figure out from that what people were reading, even if we don't have an inventory. And it might not have been, in that case, her own book. It could have been her husband's book or something. But, I don't want to make a big difference about that.
Yeah. Oh, your work sounds fascinating, Martine. It sounds like a big puzzle, and you're drawing all these little pieces together, trying to form a picture. It's truly wonderful. I've really enjoyed this. Now, at the end of our Talking Tudors episodes, what we like to do, just to get to know our guest a little bit more, is just play what I call a game of 10 to go, which is just 10 quick questions about you, really. So are you ready for that?
I'll do my best. I'm not sure I'm going to be very good at this.
I'm sure you'll be absolutely fine. So what is something you love about where you live?
Oh, well, Southern California is a fantastic place to be. I don't love the fires that we're dealing with right now, but where I live, Long Beach is right in between Los Angeles and Orange County. We can go to the beach, we can go to the mountains, we have a city to go to, so there's everything available to us here. And it's a very diverse place, which I love too. I live in a very diverse neighborhood. The university is extremely diverse. And so you encounter all kinds of cultures here.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And what about what's your favorite holiday of the year?
I like Thanksgiving, even though it's an American holiday, and I'm Dutch. I never celebrated it as a child, but I do enjoy the kind of, meal with the family type of thing. I think that's nice. Yes.
Yeah, I'd love to actually one day experience traditional Thanksgiving as well. Obviously, we don't have it here in Australia, but I like the thought of it. I don't know if you're much of a sort of Netflix watcher or anything like that, but what was the last show that you binge watched?
I watched with my daughter, we watched Stranger Things. We binge watched that, which was quite interesting. Yes, I'm not usually a big science fiction person, but it was so well acted by these young actors, and I did enjoy it.
They're exceptional, aren't they?
I'm hoping to binge watch Wolf Hall at some point. Which I haven't actually seen. I've just finished reading the first 2 books in the trilogy by Hilary Mantel, but I'm hoping to watch that at some point.
Yes, I'm sure you'll enjoy it. I've got the 3rd one sitting there, and I still haven't read it yet. It's quite a big, hefty.
It is.
So you're obviously in California. You probably don't get very much cold weather, but anyway, what's your favourite sort of comfort food?
Probably vegetarian chili. I don't know.
Oh, very good.
I could name any number of comfort foods. That's the first one that comes to mind.
Excellent. And what's something that's on your bucket list?
Well, last summer we were supposed to, we tried to go to Europe. We were supposed to go to Italy with the kids. And of course we didn't make it because of COVID. So we'll keep that on the bucket list.
Beautiful. Yeah. I think lots of us now have travel items on our bucket list. Now, obviously you speak English, and I imagine you speak Dutch as well. Do you speak any other languages?
French. I speak French, and German badly, very badly. I did take it in school. So
did you?
Yes.
Yeah, my husband's family is German, and I don't know that I'm ever going to master that one, that's for sure. I speak Spanish. That's a little bit easier.
I should speak Spanish. I feel embarrassed about not speaking Spanish after living here for 20 years. But
yeah, that would be handy for you, wouldn't it?
it would. I've been trying Duolingo. I do my best. But
yeah, excellent. And what is an ideal Saturday night for you?
Well, I would love to be able to go out to dinner again. I mean, that would be lovely. Going out to dinner, we have a favorite restaurant that we go to as a family, and it's right by the beach. And so we like to go there and then go for a little walk on the beach afterwards, seeing the sunset. That's kind of, I think that's an ideal.
Yeah, that sounds lovely. And I imagine that you have lots of favorite books, but what's one of your all-time sort of favorites? Maybe one you go back to.
I mean, a lot of, favorite books become sort of intertwined with teaching. So I guess I can say what I love to teach,
yes.
Which I'm teaching right now is Milton's Paradise Lost. It is just the most magnificent poem. Whatever you think of Milton otherwise,
yes.
It's just the most beautiful poem, and it's so rich. And the students are often very surprised. I think they go in worrying about what it's going to be like, and thinking that Milton's going to be a very stern moralist. And then they encounter just the richness of the poem, all the different things that you can take out of it, and it's just so beautifully written. So I would say that's a favorite.
And do you have any writing rituals or working rituals that you follow at all?
Well, I do write best in the morning. I find it very difficult to write later in the day. I don't know about rituals, coffee in the morning, walk the dog first, and then sit down and write for as much as I can. I think writing a lot is very important. If you write even a little bit most days, it becomes a lot easier. It's too easy to try and postpone writing and say, first I'll read everything that was ever written on this topic and then I'll write. And so I found that I need to write a little bit, even though I'm still in the process of doing the research. If I do that, I think that helps a lot.
That's such a good tip. I have found that I have changed to trying to do something every day, and I found that is much easier than leaving it, a week at a time or something like that. Yeah. And very lucky last, a favorite period film or show?
I mean, I honestly haven't watched a lot of the period films lately. I mean,
right. It might be Wolf Hall when you end up getting to.
Yes. So it might be in my future, that period.
It might be in your future. That's absolutely fine. Yes. And sorry, I said that was the last thing, but the last really last thing to ask, the very last thing is for what I call a Tudor takeaway. And it's absolutely fine if this heads into the 17th century. We're not going to get upset with you, Martina. That's fine. So something for our listeners to go and have a look at. And actually, to be honest, I've written lots of notes. You've given us so much already, so many different websites and things, but do you have a final sort of takeaway for us?
I actually found a Tudor one for your listeners. I don't know. The only thing is I haven't listened back to all the podcasts, so someone else might have said this in the past.
Oh, no, that's okay.
There is a fabulous website called bestofhardwick.org. I don't know if you know about that one, which gives you an intimate look at the life and letters of Bess of Hardwick, who, as I'm sure you're very familiar with her, this extremely powerful Tudor woman, married 4 times, had 8 children, was, moved in the top echelons of English society. The wonderful thing about the website is, first of all, you can learn to read early modern handwriting through the website. They have all the letters digitized, and then they have them transcribed, and they give you some tips on how to learn to read early modern handwriting. They have some really lovely scholarly essays and podcasts to listen to. And then they have these features like Bess of Hardwick's life in 12 letters, where you go all the way from one of the earliest letters to the last letter. They're both letters by her and written to her. So you really get a sense of her life, also how letter writing worked in the period. And it's just a wonderful resource. So I would recommend that.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. And I will add a link to that site on our show notes to make it nice and easy for everyone to find, and to lots of the other wonderful resources that you've been mentioning as well. And it's been such a pleasure chatting with you. So thank you so much for talking Tudors and the 17th century with me.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This was really fun.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On the Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.